Alright, ladies, this screencast is going to pick up with 1968 and the legacy of the Civil Rights Movement. We cannot talk about the kind of wrapping up and end of the Civil Rights Movement without addressing the year 1968, just because it's a very chaotic year within the movement and goes down as a very violent year. There's a lot of civil rights violence, anti-war, like Vietnam War, which we'll talk about more in the next unit, violence and protesting. But there's also a few important assassinations of key figures within the movement and also in a more political level. So we're going to start by talking about Dr. King's assassination. Okay, so MLK obviously has been monitoring this whole situation as the civil rights movement is becoming a little more violent and radical, and he was very much opposing that change. He never really supported violence as a response to the violence that the African American community was being treated with in the first place. So he always was kind of in opposition to the Black Power movement and, violent forms of protests. But unfortunately, his time as the kind of face or one of the key faces of the movement is coming to an end. So MLK is in Memphis, Tennessee in the year 1968. He is in Tennessee to give talks and to attend this convention. He's staying at a motel called the Lorraine Motel. Lorraine, like the name. And while he's at the hotel, he steps out onto the balcony of his hotel room and is shot by James Earl Ray, who's pictured in the bottom left, who was basically across the street and just waiting for him to come out of his room to make his move. And King will die within the hour. And James Earl Ray does get captured, and he ends up pleading guilty to murder in order to avoid the death penalty. But he will be sentenced to life in prison and will die there. Obviously, this is the end of an era, since King was really the key spokesman of the civil disobedience and nonviolent movement within civil rights. And unfortunately, people know, and the leaders in his kind of circle know that people are going to react very, outraged, as a result and in response to his murder and assassination. So leaders within, the SCLC called for peace and called, King wouldn't have wanted us to react violently to this, let's carry on his message. But unfortunately, King's death is going to lead to some of the worst riots in U.S. history. Over 100 cities across the country are basically going to burst into riots, just like we saw within Watts, in a response of anger towards King's assassination. King is not the only key figure to be assassinated in this year. We mentioned Robert Kennedy before, JFK's younger brother. Well, in the year 1968, Robert Kennedy was running for president. He was actually running to become the Democratic candidate. And he was in California giving a speech after just winning the Democratic primary when a Palestinian man named Saran kind of emerged from the crowd when he was giving a speech at a hotel and shot him several times and killed him. Saran was a Palestinian man living in America, and he claimed to not know what he was doing, and he claimed to not having any recollection of what happened. So some say he was suffering from psychosis, but nonetheless, he will be charged with murder and sentenced to prison. And I think he actually was given the death penalty, but then California outlawed the death penalty, so he was also sentenced to life in prison. Now, the reason that Robert's assassination is kind of key is because just like JFK, his older brother, he was a key supporter of civil rights. And as he was running to become president, the movement felt like he would carry on kind of what Kennedy and Johnson had been working for. So they see this as just another strike against the movement. Just makes people more angry. But Johnson's not done yet. He is going to sign one more act into law, and that is the Civil Rights Act of 1968. So that's why we need to make sure we memorize the other acts, as we already had one Civil Rights Act that was Kennedy's idea, but Johnson signs it, Civil Rights Act of 1964, now we have 68. What this Act, 68 specifically does was that it outlawed discrimination within housing. So you could not prevent someone from purchasing a house, or moving into a certain neighborhood or renting from a certain apartment building based on race. This kind of just side note, but this kind of like specifically addresses some of the issues within de facto segregation, because in some cases there were no official laws, mandating that you had to have an all-white or an all-black neighborhood, but it just kind of still happened that way in some cases because it was a reflection of socioeconomics, and this is trying to combat that a little bit, but it will still kind of happen over the years, and we'll talk about that. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about in this screencast is something that Johnson kind of started to do, but never really fully saw through, and we'll talk about that why. But basically it's going to be called the Kerner Commission. Johnson basically appoints a group of people whose sole purpose is to study the causes of urban violence and urban poverty, wanting to do specific scientific research and just social research, why are, these specific places targeted for violence and racial injustice, and what are the key underlying factors and how do we combat it. So basically, in his last few years of presidency, the Kerner Commission is doing all of this research, and in his last year, they actually issue a very long report where they name one sole cause of urban violence against African Americans, and that is white racism. So what they called for was some massive sweeping change, more than even was passed in all this legislation we've been talking about, the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. They called for new jobs, to basically construct new housing in poorer areas and end de facto segregation altogether, and just to in order to wipe out that destructive kind of ghetto inner city urban environment. But Johnson's administration, unfortunately, even though they're going to have paid and they're going to get all this information and enforce the conduction of all this research, but they're not going to do anything with it. Basically, Johnson's just going to say, well, we're going to get too much backlash if we push any harder, so we've done enough, and we're just going to have to stop from here. So we're kind of, left with this feeling of, okay, well, we've done a lot, but the Kerner Commission saying there's more to be done. Now we just need to kind of analyze what has successfully been accomplished in this movement, and we will begin reviewing those in class tomorrow, and then we'll prepare for our tests. So please listen to this and write down any questions you may have, and I will see y'all tomorrow. Have a good day.